First and foremost, no, this title isn't clickbait. I mean, that wasn't the name of this event, but it might as well have been. This was the WCW reunion show that everyone asked for, but no one knew we got. World Wrestling Legends 605, The Reunion. This was like TNA's Hardcore Justice 2010, but for WCW instead of ECW, minus any involvement from TNA. I'm sorry, that was probably a lot more confusing than it was helpful. What I'm trying to say is that this was a WCW reunion in everything but name, because legally, they could not use those 3 letters. But still, all the stars were here, except for all the ones that weren't, which were most of them. Names like Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Goldberg, Sting, Booker T, Ric Flair, Macho Man Randy Savage, Vader, Rey Mysterio, Chris Jericho, Raven, Bret Hart, will not be attending this reunion, as most were under contract somewhere else, or would just be far too expensive to get. Still, that's not to say that there aren't still some names here. You got Rick and Scott Steiner, Diamond Dallas Page, Buff Bagwell, Chris Kanyon, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Vampiro, Kamala, Disco Inferno, Jimmy Hart, the wrestler formerly known as Shane, formerly known as Vincent, formerly known as Virgil, currently known as Mr. Jones, and of course, Head of Security, Doug Dillinger. That's a killer lineup right there. And even some stars who weren't necessarily WCW mainstays, like Koko Beware, Superfly Jimmy Snuka, Nikolai Volkov, The Iron Sheik, and Greg the Hammer Valentine. Just to name a few. That's because this was being touted as a tribute to WCW Saturday Night, a show which had its roots in Georgia Championship Wrestling, pre-WCW. So these inclusions make a lot of sense. It doesn't really explain what a young Primo Cologne is doing here, or why stars of WCW Nitro, some of which have made next to no appearances on WCW Saturday Night, are the big draws here, or why the show opens up with the Nitro Girls, who noticeably were not on WCW Saturday Night, because they were on Nitro, though now they're renamed the TNT Girls. Suffice it to say, this reunion special is a little strange. And while the show is being promoted as a throwback to Saturday Night, which aired at 6:05, it's clear that it's actually a tribute to WCW and its predecessors as a whole. The show is commentated not by well-known WCW commentators, but instead by classic wrestling personalities Jim Cornette, Lance Russell, and an unimportant third guy. Dave Pencer does the ring announcing, and all of the Hebners do the refereeing for the night. So this whole thing does feel like a bit of a spectacle. The show only drew 500 people. The show starts off with the classic Patriot versus Foreign Menace, as Hacksaw Jim Duggan takes on Nikolai Volkov, who has the Iron Sheik in his corner. Sheik, who is wearing his WWE Hall of Fame shirt with his arch enemy on it. It's all a very weird visual. As you might have guessed, the match isn't a technical masterpiece by any means. It's a lot of character work with a quick finish. It's somehow exactly what you'd expect between the two, but also somehow less. A lot less, as the match lasts a little more than a minute. It's just a quick hello and goodbye. Cut to backstage where Corey Macklin interviews the dog-faced gremlin, who says nothing intelligible and just barks his way through his promo, just like you'd want him to. In the meantime, the former Vincent is announced as Virgil, despite the graphics referring to him as Mr. Jones, and he enters the ring the way Kane exits it, but midway through decides to stop and give his best Raven impression. Steiner comes in, runs around a bit, and the match is on. And almost immediately, the match is off, because yet again, this is a match that lasts under 2 minutes. It's a good thing they're not getting paid by the hour, because, well, they would just straight up not be getting paid. However, I will say that this feels like a much more athletic bout than the previous one, as Steiner rushes and hits Virgil with an impressive series of lariats. We're now 11 minutes in and 2 matches down. If it sounds like I'm speeding through these matches, I assure you, I am not. Cut backstage to another backstage interview with Nasty Boy Knobs, 1B this time around. This man's name was forever changing, but staying the same, all at the same time, who is not on the card tonight. He doesn't offer a whole lot of insight, as he's only there to get Jimmy Hart's face tattooed on his arm. Money well spent. Up next is a very subdued Disco Inferno who's taking on a birdless Koko Beware. It's a true dance battle, but somehow both men end up getting served. Again, it's another match heavily devoted to character work, as both men look to get their moves in, and I'm not talking about wrestling holds. shorts. It's a punchy-kicky affair with both guys struggling to find the time to bust a move. It's the first match to go over 2 minutes, clocking in at just over 4, and I don't think the two really worked well together. Try as they might, they just never found their groove. But, it's fine. It's a fun little match, and there's obviously some merit having the first face-off between two famous dancing gimmicks. If they would have thrown Too Cool and Rikishi in there, then this really would have been legendary. I definitely wouldn't call this good, but it was at least an attempt at something. It's more than I could say for the last 2 matches. Cut to the back where Jimmy Hart introduces his brand new insurance policy, DNA, and talks up his client, Greg the Hammer Valentine. As this show was a one and done, it makes me wonder what the purpose of all of this was. Especially considering that DNA doesn't even accompany Greg or Jimmy down to the ring. The promo was just, hey, look at this tall guy we found. Let's just make like the show and move on. Because now, the Hammer takes on the Superfly. That's right, it's Greg Valentine versus Jimmy Snuka. I'm gonna try to not bring this up unless there's too obvious of an opening. But is it bad that every time I think of Jimmy Snuka, my mind immediately goes to the Katie Vick promo?
You are a murderer.
Like the first match on the card, this one goes about as well as you'd think. If you watch Snuka at this point in his career, you probably knew what he was capable of. Although Valentine still bumps like a champ. Even Jimmy takes a few more bumps than I'm used to seeing this late into his career. It was only about 3 or 4 years later that I saw Snuka work in person, and he was much more mobile, so good on him. Must have been a real rough couple years there. Valentine manages to make all of Snuka's attacks feel incredibly impactful, so I'll give the Hammer his due. As of right now, I would have to say this is probably the most entertaining match on the card, except it ends in the most nonsensical of ways as Jimmy Hart interferes, causing the match to end in a disqualification. As the Mouth of the South is about to eat his just desserts, DNA comes down to the ring to save his handler, though he and Snuka just wind up having a stare down. Once again, money well spent. This is a real letdown. But being that this is a WCW reunion show, it feels fitting, as very rarely did matches end without the interference of multiple people. A disappointing end to an otherwise fine match. We get an ad for the WWC, showcasing highlights from the past and present, with the Guerrero's WCW theme song for some reason. At which point, the future Primo Cologne is escorted to the ring by his famous father, Carlos. His opponent for the night is none other than Vampiro. The match starts off as a squash, with Vampiro having his way with the youngster. Primo really sells the Vampire's offense, and is given a chance to showcase his abilities with his fast-paced style, selling like a pro and flying through the air with the greatest of ease. Carlos gets ejected from the match at some point, but still stays at ringside. The in-ring work is crisp, but it's perfectly crafted work between two guys who clearly know what they're doing, and provide a pretty fun match all things considered. Thus far, match of the night. I highly enjoyed this. Highlight of the match, though, would have to be the commentator accidentally calling Eddie Cologne
Eddie Cotton.
This is such good shit.
For some reason, we see a hype package for Kamala, featuring footage from his early years in Memphis Championship Wrestling. It's interesting to see how far the character has evolved, or devolved depending on how you're looking at it. He enters the ring with his handler Friday to take on Jake the Snake Roberts, who scares Kamala away with his little friend, and thankfully that is not a euphemism. Jake doesn't look great here, but he certainly looked worse on other one-off wrestling tribute shows, though he's not exactly dressed for the occasion. He doesn't look like he's looking for the victory, he looks like he's looking for the remote. Jake keeps moving back to the bag to incite fear in the Ugandan giant, a tactic which works masterfully. But the match ends with a DQ when the would-be Kim Chi interferes and Jake takes out his snake, which thankfully isn't a euphemism. This match isn't anything to write home about, but it's a fun little gimmicky bout that, for better or worse, tells a story. It's not great, but to be honest with you, I was expecting far worse. After another ad, Bruno Sammartino comes down to the ring and talks to the crowd. Dory Funk Jr. comes out and states it's an honor to share the ring with Bruno, and that he regrets never being able to face him. And that's when the dime-drawn Mike Graham comes down to basically say the exact same thing. But just then, J.J. Dillon makes his entrance, accompanied by Tully Blanchard and David Flair. Which, I get. Tully was a horseman, JJ was the manager of the Horsemen, and David's father was the Horseman. But it feels so strange seeing David substitute in for Rick. It's like watching what happens when you lie on your work application, but you get the job anyway. This segment ends with Sammartino agreeing to stand in the corner of Graham and Funk as they take on Tully and Flair. And the match is on. Now let me start off by saying, Tully can still go. I mean, that guy looks every bit of his age at this point in time, but he moves like he's still in his 30s. Mike Graham can also move, despite looking like your recently retired father. David obviously has youth on his side, so he's working with that. But Dory, on the other hand, looks very frail, and he deeply concerned me all throughout the match. He moves around like a confused turtle. He loses his place easily, and even putting his hands up to forge a fight looked like it was a challenge for him. In my personal opinion, which is worth nothing, but still, I'm going to give it to you anyway, at this stage of his career, he probably shouldn't have been allowed to compete in a wrestling ring, even if he thought that he could. I think David Flair got a lot of guff when he was in WCW for being made the nature baby to his father's nature boy, but I think a lot of people forget that there was a development there that served a purpose. The point was that he wasn't his dad. He tried to be, but he just simply wasn't. It felt like that was the intention, that was done by design. But that element is completely erased here, as he's reduced to just being there to impersonate his more famous father, wooing and yelling out "Fat Boy" to the crowd. It's actually kind of embarrassing, if I'm being honest. To David's credit, I really do think he could have potentially succeeded if he was ever allowed to step out of his dad's shadow. The insistence that he just go out there and replicate Rick and fill in shoes that were obviously never going to be properly filled kind of discredits his own capabilities. And if you think that I'm wrong on this, let's take The Miz and AJ Styles, two incredibly great workers capable of many great things. Each man was saddled with the Ric Flair 2.0 gimmick, and each man failed miserably, because that's not them. I get that there have been other nature boys, but there really is only one Ric Flair. Asking somebody else to be the next Ric Flair, even if they share DNA with him, is an unfair ask. Sure, you can make a case for Charlotte, but Charlotte is taking the gimmick to a different class and caliber of wrestling. She's also putting her own unique spin on it. I don't know, I just always felt that too much was asked of this guy. He came into the business and was immediately asked to be the man before he even learned how to take a bump properly. Sorry about the tangent, back to the match. This match had some pretty good in-ring work, all things considered. But given the fact that Bruno factored into so very little of the actual match, and that the match itself had to be worked around Dory, definitely works against it. Not great, but certainly not as bad as I was anticipating going into this. The two horsemen eat the loss, one more for the good guys. Next up, Chris Kanyon takes on his former Jersey Triad partner, Diamond Dallas Page. Page goes to make his famous entrance through the crowd, but Kanyon attacks him in front of the fans. The two walk and brawl on the outside before they make it back to the ring. I know some people aren't fans of these spots, but I actually kind of enjoy them when they happen once in a while, and when they're done properly. Here, it feels like a lot of fun. The two make their way back into the ring, and I'm really enjoying watching them, as this for me is the first match on the card that feels like it actually could have taken place in the old WCW. It feels like a continuation of their friends-turned-foes feud, with Kanyon becoming frustrated over the success his tag team partner saw. Unsurprisingly, the two work well with each other, no doubt brought on by their familiarity with each other's work and their real-life friendship. Both men are giving it their all here, and are every bit as great as they were back in the Fed. The two counter each other's offense and are quick to reverse the other man's attacks and pin attempts. I think what really makes this match great is that there doesn't seem to be any ego between the two. Both are doing everything they can to make the other look good, and succeeding at doing so. The two put each other through hell, and at times it looks like they're legitimately trying to hurt each other. Without question, match of the night. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily better than the Primo match. I think it's just as great in a different way, especially considering that this match had a pre-established history going in between the two competitors fighting. This actually makes it feel like their stories come to a climax here. It has a big match feel, and probably should have main evented the night. The real moment of note here comes after the match, though, when Paige gets on the mic and questions Chris Kanyon's sexuality, to which Kanyon admits to being gay.
I'm gay. I am the first ever openly gay professional athlete active in this country. And I don't care if you're straight, if you're gay, black, white, yellow, green, you will always be my brother.
Which leads to a maybe pop from the crowd? I remember this moment kind of going viral for a time being back in the day. The clip was easy to find on YouTube and was making the rounds in the wrestling community. But I had no idea it was part of the show. As a matter of fact, outside of this moment, I had never heard of this show before. I get that this was supposed to be a big moment for Chris, becoming the first openly gay wrestler in history, but the execution of this was a little weird. These two are best friends through and through. Even when feuding, it's clear that there's love there. So it feels more than a little weird having DDP literally out his best friend in front of 500 people and several hundreds of people watching at home. Anyway, after Kanyon is forcibly outed out of the closet, there's a 6-man tag featuring the Armstrong family with Bobby the Brain Heenan at their side, going up against the Midnight Express with Jim Cornette. Unfortunately, for one reason or another, every single copy of the show that I could find has this match missing, so I can't really make heads or tails of it. There's also additionally a dark match featuring Johnny B. Bad and a wrestler by the name of Ross Rollins, taking on Norman Smiley and the Blue Meanie. Which is weird to think that this card would have legitimate names in dark matches that were never meant to air. Norman Smiley and Johnny B. Bad were both names in WCW. They had a fair amount of fanfare. I mean, they weren't around at the same time, but fans knew who they were. The Blue Meanie was also a notable name. Maybe not known for WCW, but certainly known for his time in ECW. Why not televise this? The main event is another reignited feud between former tag team partners as Big Papa Pump Scott Steiner takes on Buff the Stuff Bagwell. Scott enters the ring with an uncredited valet, who is certainly no Medeja. After a promo between the two over the redneck crowd, their words not mine, Scott sneak attacks his old friend to get the match started. Much like the match between DDP and Kanyon, this also feels like an actual WCW matchup. Also like that match, it's between two men who are used to working with each other and thus put on a better performance because of it. The pace of this one is a little fast for my liking, until they get into a rest hold that lasts so long that it requires dissolved transitions between camera angles and close-ups on Scott's manager's face. Overall, pretty good match. Maybe not the greatest these two have had against each other, but definitely the safest. One point of contention though, Buff is the face of the place, but he forces a kiss on Scott Steiner's manager's face, which is certainly not a good guy thing to do here. Ultimately, with the aid of his newest freak, Scott Steiner gets the victory. The bad guy wins. Way to send the fans home unhappy. Overall, I would say the show is several steps below ECW One Night Stand, but several leaps and bounds above Heroes of Wrestling. It's a fun watch for the novelty alone, but if I'm being honest here, there's probably more bad than good, and more bland than anything else. Still, the good is pretty damn good. The show starts off rough, but shockingly gets better as it goes along. If you must, I would suggest just watching the last half of the show. And that was World Wrestling Legends 605 The Reunion. With that being said, if you like this video and want to see more wrestling content here on this channel, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
Really real wrestling! Really real wrestling! Really real wrestling! Really real wrestling!
Now, before I go, I don't usually do this. I've had a Patreon for a while now, but I've really struggled with what to do with it. Luckily, the time is upon us where I can actually offer you guys exclusive and extended content that I can't make here on the channel. With new restrictions on what kind of content can be monetized or hell, even shown here on the platform, now's as good a time as ever to be placing my completely unaltered, uncensored, extended videos on my Patreon. I don't want to put my videos behind a paywall, but that's kind of the best place to put them for the time being. So if there was ever a time to give a stranger money on the internet, well, I would like to think that now is that time. Just so everyone knows, all the money I make off my Patreon goes directly back into the channel. Everyone who donates to the Patreon will not be seen as a fan, but rather a producer of said content. And you will be credited as such in the closing credits here on the channel. So if you have the time and $1 to spare, help a guy out. If you can't, I appreciate your time and attention nonetheless.
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.